Hello, I'm Dr. John Kruse, and I'm going to be talking to you today about some of the positive traits or aspects of adult ADHD. The format for today is similar to the previous ones, where I'll be talking for about 20 minutes. If you have questions, you're welcome to type them in as I'm talking. You can also send questions or post them on this site afterwards, and I will try to answer them later. And yes, I am in a different location right now. I'm on vacation in sunny Lake Tahoe. I hope the quality of the broadcast is as good as it's been on the others, and I have less control over the background, so if there's intrusive noises or something, I apologize. But hopefully it will go well. And more information about this is available in my book, which is Recognizing Adult ADHD, What Donald Trump Can Teach Us About Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and I've posted more than 50 blogs on this topic on medium.com under my name, John Kruse. So recently in these podcasts, I talked about clear mortality and negative aspects of ADHD, that it's clearly associated with higher rates of death, higher rates of failing to get through school, of being arrested, winding up in jail. Clearly there are negative, that there would be reasons evolutionarily that it would seem that ADHD is not a desirable thing, and yet its prevalence at least 5% of kids, somewhere in the 5 to 10%, and 2/3 of those persisting into adulthood having it, suggests that there must be some evolutionary value to having this retained. And given that the same approximate percentage of people across the world seem to share this, also suggests that there's some advantage to having it retained. So what might those advantages be? And I'm going to be talking in a few minutes about creativity, risk-taking, candor, enthusiasm, and resilience, all of which, at least in some subset of people with ADHD, seem to be associated with ADHD. Jumping back to the evolutionary issue a little more, clearly whether a trait is advantageous now or disadvantageous now doesn't necessarily tell us why the trait originally evolved. There's actually some really interesting data that was published earlier this year by a Spanish research group drawing on, so we know that that one, ADHD has a very strong genetic contribution. Two, that the genetic contribution isn't just a single gene or a few genes, which greatly increase the likelihood you have it or you will get it. There are hundreds, if not a few thousand genes, all of which contribute a tiny bit, and having a preponderance of many of these gene variants is what gives you a high likelihood of developing it. And clearly there are environmental factors as well as the genetic factors. So the Spanish research team actually was able to look at the whole genome in modern populations and in fossilized human remains, and what they're finding, the summary of their finding, is that the propensity or the frequency of variants of genes that increase the likelihood of developing ADHD, so pro-ADHD genes, have actually decreased from past. So there's some selective pressure over the past at least 50,000 years to make ADHD genes less prevalent. And that actually is moderately inconsistent with one of the favorite evolutionary theories, that ADHD genes were desirable in a hunter-gatherer population, that sort of the restless searching profile was an advantage, and it's now a disadvantage in our more sedentary agricultural farming environment. And because the prevalence of these genes were decreasing some tens of thousands of years before agriculture became a prominent part of our lifestyle, it suggests that there are some other factors leading to selective pressure against these ADHD variants. And one of the things I point out, which hasn't gone over well in some populations, is that evolution is about differential reproductive success. So all we have to look at is why ADHD genes might have created a different differential reproductive success. And part of the answer may be in what we see right now in populations. So we know that kids, young adults with ADHD have sex at younger ages than their non-ADHD populations. They tend to have more sexual partners at an early age. And they also tend to take less protection or engage in riskier sex, all of which you would think would lead to having more children, at least at some point in time. And that may itself be what drove some ADHD traits in the past. So again, moving on to what are some of the positive apparent ADHD traits right now, and the one most closely, widely associated with ADHD and written about is creativity. Now, there are a few researchers who say that, there's no evidence that ADHD leads to greater creativity, that maybe people just blurting out more ideas, that they're being exposed to more different ideas, and or that there's less censoring of ideas, that there's more impulsive conversation, there's more impulse, that there's less pruning of the thoughts before they appear to the public or shared with others. And so that maybe ADHD people aren't more creative, they're just sharing more of what's creative, and non-ADHD people may overthink and censor out good ideas that were creative. There actually have been a few studies on creativity, and they actually do seem to suggest, and then one of the caveats is our tools for measuring creativity are fairly limited and simplistic, but there is some evidence that people with ADHD are more creative. Why might this be? Some of the evidence looking at networks involved in ADHD suggests that part of what's going on in ADHD is failure to inhibit other circuits. So if more parts of the brain are still active or engaged in a multitude of tasks, the person with ADHD may be pulling from a greater range of associations within their brain. And part of what we measure with creativity are the range of atypical or unusual responses to a situation. So how does Mr. Trump display this trait? I would argue that his whole career shows a fair amount of creativity. I mean, for someone who started out in daddy's business, which was commercial real estate, and he was given millions, actually tens of millions of dollars starting out and along the way to go into daddy's business and expand daddy's business in New York's real estate. The fact that eventually he diverted into luxury products with Trump Steaks and Trump Airline and Trump University, and then moved from those into reality television, and from there into politics. That is actually a highly creative and unusual, atypical profile. There are not any individuals who reach this level of success in our political world that I know of who have shown anything close to that creative a trajectory in life. So that's about what I'll say for creativity. In terms of risk-taking, and risk-taking may well be associated to some extent with creativity, but the impulsivity that's some of the basic symptoms of ADHD, acting more impulsively, thinking more about immediate rewards rather than long-term rewards. Risk-taking certainly adds to some of the danger or deadliness of ADHD, and given that a big chunk of the premature deaths seem to be due to accidents, particularly in the US, automobile accidents, but also suicidality. So risk-taking is not always a good thing, but in many situations, it lets you reap the advantages of taking the chance that other people weren't willing to take. So in Mr. Trump's again, many of these steps along the way that I described overall as a creative trajectory in life involved risk-taking. He didn't just stay in the real estate world. He didn't just stay, um, with The Apprentice or franchising it year after year. Again, he expanded into other areas. Those are clearly risk-taking activity. As president, actions like flying over to North Korea, particularly before he or his aides had negotiated very explicit settlements, was a risk-taking activity, which at least had the potential for reaping, greater success in causing a breakthrough in settling our issues with North Korea, particularly their ability to create or wage nuclear war. So far, that has not panned out. I would say part of what's going on right now at the domestic front, sending in federal troops into Portland, is absolutely a risk-taking endeavor. It may pay off for him in terms of either electoral support or quelling violence, but it is pretty clearly not an action that too many, if any, of his predecessors would have taken, given the risks involved. And it's not that his predecessors haven't used federal forces domestically in other situations. It's this one doesn't seem to rise to the level of chaos in the cities or the level of mayhem or dysfunction in the city. These were, by and large, protesters. I won't go too far down the political line with that. So I'm going to jump a little more to the next issue, which is candor. And that is many people with ADHD, again, there are some who are quiet or more inattentive, but many people with ADHD are prone to saying what is on their mind, speaking what's up at the moment, not pulling punches, not being politically correct, not caging their words. And in a political realm, this has been one of Donald Trump's biggest assets. So during the campaign with Hillary, he often presented himself as, I'm not going to be PC, I'm going to tell you what I think, I'm going to tell you what I'm feeling in the moment. And for framing her actions as someone who actually dares to stop and think before she speaks, must be hiding something, must be cloaking something, must be concealing what they're really feeling. That's a framework he imposed on it, and it's a framework that clearly lots of people bought into or believed. My personal take or bias is that it's probably good most of the time for politicians and for other people to think before they speak, because you are less likely to say something that's completely inappropriate, to say something that's wrong, to say something that's offensive, and not that sometimes we don't need to say offensive things, but many people with ADHD have examples of losing jobs, losing friendships, losing connections, alienating people they liked or trusted because they were too candid in the moment. In particular, I want to dwell on the fact that many, particularly of Mr. Trump's followers, equate candor with honesty, and they are not the same. So the fact that Trump and or many others with ADHD may say exactly what they are feeling at the moment, one is those thoughts or those feelings are only a portion of the range of thoughts and feelings they have on a topic. So one, what we're saying in the moment is always incomplete. But two, with Donald Trump, we know for a measurable fact that he has been less honest than even other presidents, than other politicians of, at a senatorial or governor or high prominent level. He's just made many, 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 many more statements which we know are not true. I actually think the ADHD, and as I've pointed out, he is a outlier among out and out liars in this. I would say it's important to understand ADHD. I think many of his things that have been labeled lies are not intentional. He is not providing false information with the intent to deceive. He is just blurting out what's ever at the top of his mind. So when he's talking about, whether we should inject disinfectants into our bodies or get dosed with light to kill the coronavirus, I don't think he was intentionally trying to deceive us or lie to us, or he was just rambling about what he was thinking at the moment, which was moderately relevant to the task he had started on. So again, candor is not the same as honesty. The two can be conflated or confused, but honesty has to do with telling the truth. Candor is telling your truth or your feelings at the moment. Moving on to enthusiasm, and this is probably very closely associated with the hyperactivity and impulsivity of the hyperactive form of ADHD, less likely in the inattentive form of ADHD. But again, given that the majority of people are either mixed or hyperactive, this does cover a lot of people with ADHD. There's often a restless energy, often a searching for novelty, often what I call the eternal freshman syndrome. So someone who's sort of, everything's new, everything's exciting, everything's wow. Gee, here guys, look at this, here. This is fun and exciting. That's an important part of the makeup of many individuals with ADHD. They have an infectious enthusiasm. Some of that may be, tied to that they weren't paying attention or wasn't registering it. Some of this may have been exposed to it before, like, or people have told them things before, but it's tied into, in a negative sense, when Trump keeps saying, oh, nobody said there could be a pandemic, or nobody said dealing with healthcare reform could be this complicated, or nobody said X, Y, or Z. Actually, every time he says that, numerous people have said it and said it publicly and said it to him, but it gets at that there's a sense of novelty, a sense of enthusiasm for many people with ADHD that makes them fun to be around. I mean, that's part of why people enjoy Trump's rallies. He says the same thing over and over again, but he says with such gusto, that as if it's new to him each time, that's appealing to his followers, and that's part of his charisma. I believe there's certain other, fictional characters, and you could argue frivolous or silly to identify medical or psychiatric conditions in fictional characters, but I would argue that part of the charm of Pippi Longstocking, of Anne of Green Gables, of Dennis the Menace have all been this, gee, this is new and exciting, and all of these characters also display a fair amount of other ADD symptoms. Again, getting back to Candor, all of them are notorious for saying just what they are feeling or thinking at the moment. And again, there are kids who do that to a greater extent, but part of what made them remarkable as characters is they did it even more than other kids their age. All of them were involved in risk-taking, all of them were more creative than their peers. So I would argue that Pippi Longstocking, Anne of Green Gables, and Dennis the Menace all display significant ADD, ADHD traits. So the fifth and final ADHD trait, or positive trait that I connect with ADHD is, and again, not everyone with ADHD displays this, is an element of resilience or irrepressibility. And again, some of it may be that if attention shifts so quickly that people don't stay or linger in their bad pasts, but many people with ADD have a remarkable ability to shrug off losses, shrug off defeats, shrug off trauma, and just keep on moving, keep on moving, keep on moving. Certainly Donald Trump has displayed this. I mean, someone who's had, depending on how you count them, 4, 5, 6 major bankruptcies and just keeps moving on, and actually the ability to consider himself a brilliant businessman who's had 2 failed marriages and yet still considers himself a tremendous gift to women on this planet, who had dozens of failures in terms of his Trump University, other products he launched that didn't go anywhere, and again, still sees himself as a brilliant businessman, which is, again, some of the narcissism mixed in, but his ability to move on and just keep pitching more products, including pitching himself, is a sign of this resilience or irrepressibility. I'm going to make a footnote. I'm getting close to the end of my time. There's 2 traits that I've seen in lots of not peer-reviewed, but colloquial ADHD blogs and commentaries as strong ADHD traits, that people with ADHD are more intelligent and people with ADHD are good at multitasking, that those are particular traits or superpowers. And what I'd like to say is the evidence on intelligence is that it's a fairly independent vector with ADHD. You can have brilliant people with ADHD, you can have smart people with ADHD, you can have average people with ADHD, you can clearly have people with impaired intelligence and still have ADHD. So there does not seem to be a strong correlation to the extent there is one, there is an overrepresentation of ADHD traits in people with limited intelligence or sub-average intelligence. Again, not that, so again, someone's ADHD, if that's all you know about them, doesn't tell you anything about whether they're intelligent or not. And also I'd say with multitasking, there are a few studies, no studies that I'm aware of show that people with ADHD are better at multitasking than the general population. They may do it a lot more. And there are a few studies, more in kids than in adults, showing children with ADHD actually are less efficient, less effective at performing tasks than at multitasking. Then, I mean, we know that multitasking to begin with disrupts efficiency and makes people less productive, but kids with ADHD actually seem to be even less productive when they're multitasking. So that's about all I'm going to say for today. Again, I'm seeing one question, and I'm going to probably have to put my glasses on to read it. Next week's topic is the overlap or distinguishing between ADHD and narcissism. And so again, that will be for next week. So the question right now is, what do you think the comment to ADHD, people think outside the box? It sure can be a gift, but do we make the most of it? So again, I think thinking outside the box is, I guess, another term for creativity. It may not be the only aspect of creativity, but certainly picking unconventional associations is a strong part of it. And yes, to sort of echo the idea in that comment, many people with ADHD are creative, but a certain subset of those people, the ADHD actually interferes with their ability to be productive or share their insights or build on their creativity. And in many cases, either medications or cognitive behavioral approaches or other therapies for helping with some of the ADHD helps creative ADHD types be more productive with their creativity. So that's about all I'll say for now. Have a good and safe week, and I will be back next Friday at 11.